It all started with a routine hike up my own mountain, the one I had worked 3 jobs and spent every spare dollar to buy, the one place I thought was untouchable because it was mine, on paper, in my heart, and by every legal right you could imagine. But as I rounded the last bend on that familiar trail and caught sight of what had been my quiet, pine-scented sanctuary for years, my jaw nearly hit the forest floor, because there, smack in the middle of my property, was a half-finished house, construction crews buzzing like angry wasps, trucks parked on my dirt road like they owned the place, and a bright plastic sign that read, "Future Home of Summit Vista Luxury Cabin, HOA Project," as if slapping a fancy name on it gave them the right to hijack my land, and for a long moment I just stood there, heart hammering, mind blank, trying to process how in the world anyone could be bold or stupid enough to build on land that didn't belong to them without so much as a phone call, a knock on my door, a letter, nothing, just full-on invasion like this was the Wild West, and I was some absentee rancher they could push around. When I finally stormed down there, the foreman, a wiry guy in a neon vest with a clipboard, gave me a bored look, the kind you reserve for lost hikers asking for directions, until I told him this was my land and he better pack up and leave before. I called the sheriff, and that's when he smirked, actually smirked, and said, "You'll have to talk to the HOA about that, buddy. We got permits. Like some homeowners association had more power than the county records that had my name on the deed. Like their word was law and I was some trespasser on my own property, and that was the moment I felt the first real spark of anger catch in my chest, because I knew right then this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was arrogance, pure and simple. The kind that festers when people get a taste of power over lawn heights and mailbox colors and start thinking they're kings of the whole mountain. I went straight to the HOA office, a squat little building at the edge of the subdivision, creeping ever closer to my land like ivy, and the board president, a woman named Marjorie with helmet hair and the permanent scowl of someone who alphabetized her spice rack, greeted me with that tight-lipped smile people use right before they tell you to get lost. And when I demanded to know why there was a house on my property, she launched into some spiel about community expansion and unused land, and how the HOA had voted to approve a vacation rental cabin to bring value to the neighborhood, as if my acres of pines and rock outcrops were just waiting for their blessing to become profitable, and when I told her it wasn't unused, it was mine, bought and paid for, with survey markers still in place, she waved a manicured hand and said they'd looked into it and determined it was within HOA boundaries now, like they could just vote my deed out of existence. I left before I said something that would get me arrested, but not before promising her and every smug board member in that room that they hadn't heard the last of me, not by a long shot. Over the next week, I dug through every county record, every plat map, every scrap of paper proving that land belonged to me. And when I showed up to the next HOA meeting with a folder thick enough to choke a horse, Marjorie barely glanced at it before saying the board had already moved forward, and any dispute would have to go through their legal department, which turned out to be some guy named Cliff who ran a tax prep business on the side and liked to quote HOA bylaws like they were scripture. But even he went pale when I pointed to the notarized survey showing the cabin sat a good 50 feet inside my property line. You'd think that would have ended it. You'd think they'd have tucked their tails, apologized, maybe offered to buy the land fair and square. Instead, Marjorie said, "Well, the structure is already up, so removing it would be a waste of community resources, like the thing squatting on my land was some kind of gift I should be grateful for." And that's when I realized they thought I wouldn't fight back, that I'd roll over the way all their subdivision residents did when told what color to paint their fences or how short to cut their grass. But this wasn't a lawn, it was my mountain, and I wasn't about to let a pack of power-drunk suburbanites steal it out from under me. So I hired a lawyer, a real one, not a tax guy with a briefcase full of bylaws, and he sent a cease and desist that should have frozen everything. But the HOA ignored it, kept right on building, even ran an ad in the local paper for Summit Vista Cabin, coming soon, like it was already theirs to sell. That ad was the last straw. I rented the biggest bulldozer the local equipment yard had, drove it up there at dawn one Saturday, and while the HOA board shrieked and waved their arms like I was about to run over their firstborns, I leveled that half-finished palace of theirs. In under an hour, splintered wood and shattered windows raining down like justice from the sky, because if they thought they could plant their flag on my land and keep it by sheer stubbornness, They were about to learn what stubborn really looked like. The sheriff showed up just as I was knocking down the last wall, but when I showed him the same folder of deeds and surveys I'd shown the HOA, he tipped his hat, said, "Looks like you're within your rights," and left me to finish the job while Marjorie shrieked about lawsuits and vandalism and how the community would never stand for this kind of behavior, as if the community had any say in what happened on my side of the property line. By noon, the cabin was nothing but a pile of rubble, the kind that made insurance adjusters cry, and the HOA board was huddled like wet cats, plotting whatever came next. But I already knew. They wouldn't take this lying down, not people like that, people who got high off control and couldn't stand losing even an inch of it. And sure enough, 3 days later, a manila envelope landed in my mailbox, thick with legal threats, because if they couldn't steal my land by building on it, they'd try to bury me in court instead. And that was fine by me, because I was just getting started. And if the HOA wanted a war, I was ready to bring them one they'd never forget. 3 days after the dust had settled, literally since I was still sweeping splinters off my own land, the manila envelope hit my mailbox like a brick through a window, thick with papers stamped in bold letters. Notice of lawsuit. The kind of thing designed to make your stomach drop even if you know you're in the right. And sure enough, the HOA wasn't just coming after me for property damage and reckless endangerment and a dozen other dramatic-sounding charges. They were demanding punitive damages, attorney fees, and, in a twist that would have been funny if it weren't so infuriating, an injunction to prevent me from interfering with any future HOA projects, as if I was some rogue vandal who got his kicks wrecking half-finished buildings instead of the actual property owner defending what was his. And reading through the legal jargon that night at my kitchen table, I could practically hear Marjorie's voice dripping with satisfaction, because this was her battlefield. Not bulldozers and survey stakes, but paperwork and court dates. A slow, grinding war of attrition designed to bleed me dry. And for about 5 minutes, I actually felt a flicker of doubt. Lawyers were expensive, courts were slow, and HOAs had a way of twisting facts until up looked like down. But then I remembered the look on her face when the sheriff sided with me, that furious disbelief, and I knew backing down now would be like handing her my land gift wrapped. So the next morning I called my lawyer. A barrel-chested bulldog named Harris, who'd spent 20 years chewing up shady developers for breakfast, and when I told him the HOA wanted to sue me for tearing down the house they'd built on my property, he actually laughed. A deep, wheezing thing like he hadn't had this much fun in years, and said, "Oh, this is going to be good." We filed a countersuit before their ink was even dry, not just for trespassing and illegal construction, but for emotional distress, legal fees, and punitive damages of our own. Because if they wanted a war, we'd bring artillery, and pretty soon it wasn't just one case on the docket, but 3. Theirs against me, mine against them, and a third involving the county after Harris dug up permits showing the HOA had accidentally submitted plans listing my property under their name. A little clerical fraud that turned into a big problem once the DA started sniffing around. Meanwhile, Marjorie and her crew launched what can only be described as a smear campaign straight out of a political thriller. Letters to the editor painting me as some violent loner endangering the community, flyers slipped into mailboxes calling me unstable, even a post on the neighborhood Facebook group claiming I'd threatened workers with a gun, which was a bold lie considering half the county had watched me knock that cabin down with nothing more dangerous than heavy machinery, and righteous anger. But facts didn't matter to people like her, only appearances. And for a while, I'll admit it worked. Neighbors who used to wave started looking at me like I was one step away from a headline, the kind with words like dispute and tragedy. But then Harris got his hands on the HOA's financial records through discovery, and that's when things got interesting. Because it turned out Summit Vista Luxury Cabin wasn't some altruistic community project at all, but a rental scheme cooked up by Marjorie's brother-in-law, funneled through HOA funds without a proper vote, which meant every dues-paying member had unknowingly been financing her little empire-building hobby, and when Harris leaked that nugget to the same paper they'd used to smear me, the tide turned fast, neighbors showing up at HOA meetings demanding answers, board members resigning, before the ship sank with them still on it. And through it all, Marjorie clung to power like a cat on a screen door, insisting this was all my fault. A personal vendetta, distracting from the real issue of me destroying community property, which would have been hilarious, if it weren't so pathetic, because by then even the county had filed motions confirming the land was mine, The permits were fraudulent, and the HOA had zero legal standing to build so much as a doghouse on my side of the line. The court dates piled up like firewood, each one a new chance for Harris to dismantle their case piece by piece, and watching him work was like watching a wolf toy with sheep, polite but merciless, until even the judge started side-eyeing Marjorie's. Witnesses like he could smell the nonsense from the bench. Still, they kept coming, motion after motion, appeal after appeal, dragging things out in the hope I'd run out of money or patience. But what they didn't know was that I'd mortgaged half my soul to keep that land when I first bought it. Lived out of a camper for 2 years to make the payments, ate beans and rice till I couldn't look at a tortilla without twitching, so there was no universe where I'd fold now just because some HOA queenpin didn't like losing. And the longer it went, the more it backfired on them anyway. Reporters digging through public records, finding other projects with missing funds, former board members suddenly remembering things once subpoenas started flying, until what started as a property dispute turned into a full-blown corruption scandal splashed across the local news. Cameras camped outside HOA meetings, while Marjorie tried to spin embezzlement allegations as accounting errors, and I sat in the back, arms crossed, letting her dig her own grave one soundbite at a time. By the time our main case finally went to trial, the HOA was a skeleton crew of panicked volunteers and one very tired lawyer who looked like he regretted ever meeting Marjorie. And when the verdict came down, my favor on every count, there. Lawsuit dismissed with prejudice, my countersuit upheld, damages to be determined later. She actually stood up in court and shouted that the judge was biased, like this was some HOA meeting she could gavel her way through, and the bailiff had to ask her to sit down before she got herself held in contempt. But even that wasn't the end, because people like Marjorie don't go quietly. She filed appeals, complaints, even some handwritten motions citing community sovereignty, like the HOA was its own country with laws above the states, each one swatted down faster than the last, until finally the county seized HOA records for a full audit, and the DA started muttering about criminal charges, and somewhere in all that chaos, Marjorie vanished from public view. No more statements, no more meetings, just a for sale sign in front of her house one day, and a rumor she'd moved 3 states over to live with a sister who hopefully didn't let her near any neighborhood associations. As for me, I got my land quiet again. The lawsuits behind me, the rubble cleared, the survey stakes bright against the tree line like sentries guarding what was mine. But the war had left me with something bigger than property, a story that spread through every subdivision and small-town diner for 50 miles, the tale of the HOA that tried to steal a mountain and ended up burying itself instead. And as I stood there one evening watching the sun burn gold across my ridges, I knew it wasn't over, not entirely because people like that never really quit, they just regroup. And somewhere out there, Marjorie was nursing her grudge like a campfire, waiting for another chance to strike, which was fine by me, because now I had lawyers, reporters, and half the county on speed dial, and if she or anyone else came for my land again, they'd better bring more than lawsuits and lies because I'd already beaten both and had no problem doing it twice. You'd think after losing in court, after being exposed in the papers, after watching half her board jump ship and the county auditors march off with boxes of HOA records like vultures with roadkill, Marjorie would have finally slunk off into obscurity to lick her wounds, but people like her don't go down easy. And in the weeks after the verdict, when I was finally sleeping through the night without visions of courtrooms and subpoenas, I started hearing little rumors on the wind. Things like, the HOA's reorganizing and Marjorie's talking to a lawyer friend out of state. Whispers dropped by neighbors at the diner, by the guy who ran the gas station at the foot of the mountain, by the mailman who'd had a front row seat to every manila envelope where we'd fought. And sure enough, one rainy Tuesday, a letter arrived. Not from the old HOA. What was left of it was in receivership after the audit found financial irregularities big enough to drive a truck through, but from a brand new outfit calling itself the Summit Vista Community Alliance, with a fresh logo, a new P.O. box, and if the fine print was to be believed, jurisdiction over all lands contiguous to the existing neighborhood, which was lawyer speak for, "We're coming for your mountain again." And I just stood there in my kitchen holding that letter, rain ticking against the windows, wondering if these people were gluttons for punishment or just plain stupid, because after everything, after the bulldozer, the lawsuits, the audit, the criminal investigations, they still thought they could lawyer their way into owning land that wasn't. Theirs. Like the problem had been branding, not the fact that deeds and property lines don't vanish because some committee says so. But this time I didn't get angry. I didn't storm down to any office or rent heavy machinery or even call Harris, though he would have loved another round in court. No, this time I got curious because buried in that letter, under the legal threats and pompous language about community stewardship, was a line about partnering with local developers, and that set off a little bell in my head. Because the last time Marjorie had partnered with anyone, it turned out to be her brother-in-law skimming HOA funds for his rental dreams. So I spent a few evenings digging, public records, corporate filings, anything I could find. And pretty. Soon a picture started forming, one with shell companies registered to P.O. boxes 3 counties over, development plans for eco-resorts on land that sure looked a lot like mine, and guess whose name popped up as a consultant on half? The paperwork? Marjorie herself, like some cartoon villain who thinks a fake mustache makes her unrecognizable. The beauty of it was, they hadn't just targeted me this time. There were parcels all along the ridge flagged for community integration, some owned by retirees who'd been here since before the subdivision even existed, people who didn't have the money or stomach for a fight, and that's when I realized this wasn't just about my land anymore. It was a land grab, pure and simple, dressed up in HOA language about beautification and shared resources. And if they got away with it, half the mountain would be timeshares before the ink dried. So I made some calls to the retirees, to the local reporter who'd covered our court case, to a buddy on the county planning commission who still owed me for helping dig his truck out of a snowbank last winter. And by the end of the week, we had a little alliance of our own, one with actual landowners, a reporter hungry for another corruption story, and a county official very interested in words like fraud and forgery appearing in election season headlines. We started feeding the reporter everything, copies of the developer agreements, the shell company registrations, even drone photos one tech-savvy neighbor took of survey crews sneaking around properties they didn't own. And 2 Sundays later, the paper ran a front-page story titled Summit Vista HOA Tied to Secret Development Deals, complete with a photo of Marjorie in her signature blazer, looking like someone had just stepped on her grave. By Monday, the county announced a full investigation. By Wednesday, the state attorney general was involved. And by Friday, 3 of Marjorie's new alliance partners had lawyered up and stopped returning her calls because, funnily enough, investors don't like being linked to potential fraud before breakfast. Meanwhile, I filed suit again, this time with half a dozen other landowners as co-plaintiffs, not just for trespass or damages, but for something Harris called a quiet title action, basically the legal equivalent of carving our property, lines into stone so no future HOA, alliance, or wannabe empire builder could ever claim confusion again. And while that wound through the courts, the county hit Marjorie and her pals with injunctions freezing all their projects. So the only thing they managed to build was a bonfire of their own paperwork every time the press came sniffing around. The final nail came from the audit report, the one the old HOA thought they'd buried in committee, but was now public record thanks to a very determined reporter. And when people read about the misallocated funds, the unauthorized expenses, the consulting fees paid to companies with names suspiciously similar to Marjorie's initials, well, let's just say the next HOA meeting, held in the high school gym because so many residents showed up, ended with a vote to dissolve the entire association. Not just the board, but the bylaws, the dues, the whole meddling apparatus, gone like smoke on a windy day, cheered into oblivion by people who looked 20 pounds lighter, now that nobody was measuring their grass or telling them what color to paint their shutters. As for Marjorie, last I heard she was under informal investigation by the state for financial misconduct. Her house sold at a loss, her name mud from here to the county line, and when a reporter asked if I had any comment about her downfall, I just said I hoped she found a hobby that didn't involve other people's property lines. The court eventually granted our quiet title action, stamped and sealed, meaning my land, and everyone else's, was now legally untouchable by any HOA, alliance, or alphabet soup committee until the sun burned out. And to celebrate, I threw a barbecue on the very spot where the Summit Vista luxury cabin once stood, now just a flat clearing with the best sunset view on the mountain, and half the county showed up with lawn chairs and potato salad, laughing about the time some HOA tried to steal a mountain and ended up destroying itself instead. Looking out over the ridge that evening, the sky going purple and gold, I felt the kind of peace you can't buy, the kind you fight for, the kind that comes from knowing the bullies lost, the land endured, and the next time someone gets the bright idea to mess with what's mine, they'll have to think real hard about whether they want to end up like Marjorie, queen of nothing, exiled from the empire she tried to build on lies and stolen lumber. And that's how it all ended. A mountain reclaimed, a corrupt HOA dismantled, and a power-hungry president left with nothing but regrets. They tried to take what wasn't theirs, and paid the price. If you enjoyed this wild story of justice served, hit that like button, subscribe to Hidden Compass Stories, and ring the bell so you never miss the next tale of revenge, drama, and small-town chaos, because here the truth always wins, and we've got plenty more where this came from.